Laura Claridge, author of Norman Rockwell, A Life. When did you get interested in this artist?
1994-95, I went to Cooperstown to the Baseball Hall of Fame and with my children, and I got very bored at some point just looking at all the baseball memorabilia. But in the anteroom, there's an exhibition of good art on different sports subjects, and there was one that I'd never seen before, but it riveted my attention because of the striking color and the use of form, and it was Norman Rockwell's Calling the Game. And from that point on, I started thinking, gee, this is something I don't know about because this isn't what my image of Norman Rockwell is.
What's your image of Norman Rockwell now?
That's an interesting question. As a person, since this is a biography, as a person, a highly intelligent and shrewd, depressive, honorable, deeply honorable, very, very talented, I would say first-rate artist. I guess I've encompassed both his personality and my own judgment of his art.
When did he die and how old was he?
Died in 1978. He was 84, lived a long life, and was active in his art and a very active a man until maybe 2 years before his death.
What age was he when this picture on the cover was taken?
Well, his family lent me that picture, and none of us have been able to find the origins, but we're guessing it was his mid-20s. He was in his mid-20s.
What was he doing in his mid-20s?
He was a playboy, and he was living a pretty a debauched life in an open marriage and experimenting with high society in New Rochelle, New York.
How many children did he have? How many times was he married?
3 children, 3 marriages, but the 3 children went with the second marriage. That's interesting. He was a high school dropout, and actually, let's see, at age 16, and never had any formal education after that. And he married 3 school teachers. That's not very difficult, it seemed to me, to see a kind of fulfilling of something that he valued. And they read to him. One of the requirements, it seems, of marriage for him was that his wife read aloud great novels while he painted. And the first marriage is this one I referred to in the 1920s. He married 1916 and was divorced in 1929 when the woman left him precipitously for a handsome pilot. What's funny about that, or interesting about it, is he almost denied the marriage ever happened, in spite of the fact that it was a 14-year-long marriage. His 3 sons found out about it only in the 40s when they read an article in the New Yorker about his life. He'd never bothered, and when they confronted him, he said, "Oh, I didn't think it was important." So, which is that it's a very strong psychological defense of Rockwell's denial, or repression.
We'll come back to that, but I want to show some of the art that you have in the book. What is this painting right here?
The triple self-portrait, which he did in 1960, and it's fascinating because of its geniality, but at the same time a real kind of what some people would call a postmodern spin, where he's painting himself, but ironically, gently mocking himself. If you can see the actual black and white on the canvas is a younger, more handsome man. He's looking, however, in the mirror as if he's copying what he's seeing, and the image that's reflected back in that mirror, to add yet another layer of ambiguity, is the eyes are whited out.
What's that? Who are those folks up in the right-hand corner?
There's Rembrandt. These are self-portraits, and it's important. A self-portrait of Rembrandt, Durer. Not a self-portrait, but a painting by Picasso that implies self-portraiture in a complicated relationship to the women in his life. So Rockwell was situating himself, Mr. Modest, among these greats as he himself attempted the self-portrait and admitted he didn't know who he was to some extent.
Where can you see that painting of his self-portrait?
In the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which is a wonderful building. The architect, Robert A.M. Stern, designed it and has an excellent collection, due largely to the insight of his third wife and foresight. About, I guess from here, it's probably about a 7-hour drive from Washington, D.C.
You point out in your book that in the old museum or whatever, the art gallery that he had there on the main street in Stockbridge, he got about 5,000 visitors a year, and the new one has 100,000 a year.
Yes, and apparently going up, the figure's going up every year.
How did Steven Spielberg get into this?
I've heard two different stories, but the one I credit, I think more comfortably, Spielberg was in town and at the Red Lion Inn, and someone went up to him involved with the museum and said, we've heard you like Rockwell, and we're raising money for a new museum and would love for you to be involved, and arranged meetings, and it went from there. Spielberg does have a long time affection for Rockwell.
Also have this painting that you see a lot of. Where is it located now? What is it? And when did we see it, in what publication?
Well, this is an extraordinary painting that was done late. What's interesting to me is late in his career and life. Rockwell was in his, I would have been in his 70s just about by now. The problem we all live with, it's a representation of the of Ruby Bridges having to go to school when the South was being desegregated, and that painting is now at the museum also. But it was done for Look magazine. But what I find extraordinary is that it represents this very strong liberal political desire to paint what was happening in the world. That Rockwell was willing to go in that direction fairly late for an artist. I mean, to start a very new direction in his work.
You point out in your book that he voted for Norman Thomas,
yes,
the socialist candidate in 1948. Was he very political himself?
No, well, he was vociferous in announcing to everyone around him that he was not a political man, and that was to get out of all the different requests to endorse so-and-so, and also he didn't want to alienate his audience by saying the wrong choice, the wrong person. But, you know, that question interests me, what it means to be political. He was not overtly political. He was, however, a man of very deep convictions, so my own answer would be, at heart, yes. His children, his three sons, would quickly say to me, but don't forget, he was avowedly apolitical, except for occasional endorsements. He loved Ike for the first term, and then afterwards he said he had been a little disappointed in him the second time. He disliked Nixon. So he would make those kinds of statements, sotto voce or to friends, but that was about it.
You point out in the book that at one point he had a dinner with Eisenhower, General Eisenhower.
Yes.
Where was that, and what impact did that have on him?
Well, he was invited to what he called a stag dinner that apparently President Eisenhower gave to get a little bit of freedom or free room to be himself with men he liked. And he, after Rockwell painted his portrait and the two hit it off, then sometime later Rockwell got an invitation in the mail to one of these stag dinners in Washington, and he came. He enjoyed it immensely and spoke of it fondly in years afterwards. But what's interesting to me is he was so nervous, and by this time he was well established and well loved, and certainly a cosmopolitan and a world traveler, but he had to take tranquilizers to get through the dinner. And he was, and his tuxedo didn't fit, and nothing was right. So I've always taken that as a sign. All of this as a sign that he deeply respected Eisenhower, to care that much for his opinion of how Rockwell conducted himself or looked during that dinner.
This painting of Willie Gillis in church,
yes,
1942.
Yes. During World War II, Rockwell was very interested in providing well to the war effort, what we would call wartime propaganda pictures, and that's not necessarily a pejorative, and it was just used descriptively at the time. He had been a bit young to participate in World War II, and also there were illustrators they were just ahead of him, you know, James Montgomery Flagg and Leyendecker. So at this time it was Rockwell's turn, is how he saw it. And what I find interesting about the Willie Gillis picture, that one particularly, he did 11 Willie Gillis pictures. And his take, instead of showing the glamorous, handsome man that Leyendecker used for World War I, he showed this kind of every boy next door, the shock of red hair, in this case neatly combed. And in this picture, sitting somberly in church as if, we don't know if he's attending a funeral or if this is simply a wartime church service, but there's a quietness about it that's one of Rockwell's attempts to convey the seriousness of war.
You say, though, when he was asked by the Marines to do some work in Vietnam, he said no. Why?
Well, that was during the Vietnam War, and he never regretted supporting and contributing so heavily to the World War II cause, and he was a major raiser of money for the Office of War Information and the Treasury Department. But by the Vietnam War, not only had he married someone who brought out his most liberal tendencies, a New England schoolteacher, but he himself was so anti-violence, it had been all his life, that the ambivalence that many people that he trusted felt towards the Vietnam War gave him pause. So that by the time he had to confront whether he was willing to contribute to the wartime propaganda, pictorial wartime propaganda for that war, he wasn't convinced it was the right thing. So finally, because he was in the end a very honorable person, he just said, I'm not the right man for this.
When was he the most popular?
I guess the 1950s, although I say that with some hesitation because what surprised me in the research for this book was how popular from the beginning of his career. I'm talking by 1920, when he was only 26 years old. He had made his fortune, or was certainly on the way to making it. He was well known. The press on him is voluminous. So this is a man who was famous throughout throughout a good 4 decades.
You have this painting that says in the cut line that was 1916?
Yes. Can you imagine that? At age 20, barely, maybe he was even 19, he did his first cover for the Saturday Evening Post, the first of what would be 322, which is an extraordinary feat. That was the plum assignment to get the cover of the Saturday Evening Post then.
Why the Saturday Evening Post? And you know, it's now still around, and I think they even still call it the Curtis Publishing Company, based in Indianapolis, but it's a monthly, and it doesn't have anything close to the circulation it used to have.
Well, you mean, why did he choose the Post, or why was it so viable then?
How did that work out, and what happened to the, you know, at what time was it a prominent magazine?
Right.
And what happened to it?
Around the time that Rockwell was born in 1896, the Post had been struggling, and it actually started out as Benjamin Franklin's Gazette, Pennsylvania Gazette, back in the 1700s. And at this point, when Rockwell was born, it was struggling for its very existence, and Cyrus Curtis brought in someone else, George Horace Lorimer, who took it over and revitalized it.
Where was it based?
It was based in Philadelphia at this point. So it's important because it's about 100 miles away from where Rockwell was born and growing up in New York City, by the way. He was a New York City boy, which many people don't realize. This was going on, and the Post started, it tried to combine a kind of urbanism with a real solid, this is what it means to be American. And George Horace Lorimer saw as his mandate the idea of unifying an America that was, at that point, at the turn of the century, 70% of the children in New York City had foreign-born parents, which is an extraordinary figure. So Lorimer believed, and some people later accused him of isolationism as a result, that we ought to have a magazine that showed us what it was to unify and be a national consciousnness. It wasn't that long after the Civil War, don't forget, when you really think about it.
300 and how many covers?
322.
How often was that consecutive weeks?
Not often. I think the most he ever did in 1 year was 11.
Were they controversial ever?
I don't remember the covers ever being controversial. I remember the Civil rights pieces in the 60s were. And then he actually helped out CORE, which was a radical left racial rights group in New York City. That was a bit controversial. But the post covers, the only thing I remember is when he would do one, there was one with a young girl who you couldn't quite be sure she was a girl or boy. And he got a real overspill of letters on, not so much on that he should have been clear about the gender, but that what was he doing making a girl look so sloppy? Or what was he doing making a boy look so connected to girlish things, which I find fascinating.
How many biographies have been written about Norman Rockwell?
In the conventional sense of a kind of soup to nuts biography, this is the first one. There are several partial stories, and he wrote an autobiography in 1959.
How did you go about doing this?
Well, when I became very serious about it and realized I was determined this was a life I wanted to pursue, I wrote his middle son, Tom Rockwell, and said, could we meet? And expecting that this would be a drawn-out, year-long process, because often it is when you're trying to get the family's cooperation. And to my shock, I got an immediate response, come up and see me in Poughkeepsie, New York. So,
what's he doing?
He's a writer of children's books, and his wife's an illustrator. They live on a farm. They've had for some years. Lovely man.
Why did you write Tom and not Peter or Jarvis?
Somehow I had been told, and I don't remember how I knew, but I'd been told that he was the executor of the estate. So I knew he was the right person.
How old is he now?
The three sons are in their 60s, all three of them, within 6 years of each other. So he, anyway, he had me up to Poughkeepsie, and it just happened. When we sat there, he said, I'll tell you that I've been waiting. We've decided, the family, that now is a good time to be honest, to be open, and do you use footnotes? And I said, I was taken aback. I said, well, what do you mean? I'm a scholar, of course and he said, because we've had people who wanted to do it and didn't want to document or use scholarship. And I said, well, of course. And I thought that was a very sweet question, though, and he's a highly intelligent man, and a kind of gentle way of saying. So he asked me to send him a copy of my book that was then coming out, and I did, and we talked some more, and then the three brothers had to talk, and it wasn't that they had to authorize it. I wouldn't write an authorized biography anyway, but I thought it would be paying it, not giving it its due, the subject, if I didn't have the family's cooperation at all.
What about the other two brothers? Where are they?
One's in Rome. He's a sculptor, stone carver, Peter, the youngest, and then the oldest, Jarvis, is in Great Barrington, Massachusetts.
Did you talk to all three?
Oh, time and time and time again. In fact, it was wonderful. I got to go to Tuscany and spend part of a summer with Peter and his wife, and I had thought, gee, this is one book that will keep me right in the Northeast. Unfortunately, I won't get to travel, but who would guess? And Great Barrington, Jarvis, they were all so open to meeting me wherever and whenever I needed.
I think you mentioned from time to time he had a journal of some kind.
That he did, or that I did?
Norman Rockwell.
Yes, he did. And this was a little find. One day I was going through one of the boxes in the museum archives, and it's a room, a large room that's just stocked with boxes and memorabilia. Some of it has not been cataloged. So I was going through one of the boxes that everybody thought had been filed properly, and there was a small old journal that it turned out was Rockwell's private diary from the 1930s. He had taken a camping trip. And it was this wonderful moment of discovery where I called over the archivist, Linda Perro, and she was excited because she knows just about everything, and she hadn't seen this. And we went through it, and then she told one of the sons, and he was excited because it was just nice to read an uncensored account that Rockwell clearly did not mean for public consumption of what it was like for him to go camping for 6 days when his two young sons were back at home with his wife, and what he thought of.
But there are other references to either a calendar or something where he would, I know,
late in
his life, yeah.
Yes, that was very good too. Almost at the end of when I was finishing the biography, Tom Rockwell decided that to share with me the calendars that his father had kept the last 10 years of his life, and Rockwell would just jot down things that had happened during the day, or things he was worried about, or what was coming up, or what had happened. And it was unbelievably helpful to get a sense of where his thinking was during those last 10 years of his life. To go through, it's actually, at this point, I guess they were those little pages you put on a Rolodex, what do you call it, where the spiral thing. And so they had been taken off and each year banded with, with rubber band. So you can just kind of go through each page.
Where did you go to find things Rockwell besides the Sons?
Well, the museum archives, which is an unusual resource. Usually when you're doing a biography, you have to go everywhere for years to collect what they've already collected, so that was lovely.
Where is it?
That's in Stockbridge at the museum. And then I also went, I just tried to ferret out, like biographers do, anybody who'd had any connection with Rockwell or who was close to someone who had been Rockwell's friend or associate. Because, so for instance, I met with somebody who had been his housekeeper at the end of his life.
Name?
Virginia Lovelace, a wonderful woman, has a farmhouse, and what was interesting to me is to watch her trust unfold, where over the years I stayed with her often at the farmhouse, and she decided I was all right, and she would share more and more of a more intimate nature.
Give us some of the things that you learned from her that are important to the book.
All right, this sounds so trivial, but it helped reassure me of something I wondered about. The third marriage, I hope this doesn't sound too prurient, but the third marriage was, Rockwell was in his 60s and had lost his wife 2 years before to an unexplained death, and it was very traumatic for him. And he was then the hot bachelor in town in Stockbridge, because you can imagine the women who weren't married who were pursuing him then.
Let me ask you about Stockbridge. Where is it in the world?
Stockbridge is within 10 minutes of the New York state line, and it's in Massachusetts. And
west end of Massachusetts?
I'm so bad. East from New York, obviously. But
not east like Boston. It's
in the
the other
Berkshires,
end of
right, in the Berkshires, absolutely.
What's it like there?
On the surface, it's a lovely little New England small town, cosmetically attractive, and all those white picket picket fence ways, full of intellectuals, full of artists, very little obvious activity that would sustain it financially, and yet quite a bit of wealth there. So
you have a picture in the book. It's some years ago. Does it still look like this?
You know, it does. If you change the cars, update the cars to the early 21st century, that's pretty much what it looks like.
And you say Norman Rockwell's looking out through that big picture window up there?
Yes.
What was that?
He had that window put in. When he moved to Stockbridge, he actually had a studio. That was the studio, and he created it above a butcher shop, and he needed good northern light, so he had the front knocked out and that glass put in, and he liked to just kind of look over the town during the day and to see what was going on, to paint.
So now that we've seen a little bit of the town, go back to the housekeeper and her name again?
So, Virginia Lovelace, and she had, her husband, or ex-husband, had been an art director at Austin Riggs at the institution there for treatment of mental illness, and Mary, Rockwell's second wife, had been treated there for 10 years, and Rockwell himself had started analysis there and therapy for his depression. So she knew a lot. They'd socialized together, been at parties with Eric Erikson, the psychoanalyst, and had heard a lot. So when, but then the point is that when the second wife died and Rockwell was about to remarry, he ended up choosing a school teacher who had never been married. She was in her 60s, and who seemed quite prim and proper. And one of the sons told me that, in fact, Rockwell had shared with him that he was worried what their sexual life would be after marriage. He was just worried because he didn't know, he said. And so I asked Virginia, I said, you were the housekeeper. You lived with them the last years of their lives. What do you think? And she said, well, I'll think about this. Very proper woman. And so then the next time I saw her, she said, I want to share with you that I am sure that the Rockwells enjoyed a lovely, passionate, and intimate relationship. And that kind of thing. And she just told me a few substantiating details. But the point being that I became convinced that what looked like their happiness was on all levels.
So the three sons and a housekeeper, anybody else that was close to him or understood him very well?
Well, I mean, so many. For instance, one of my research assistants got in touch with a woman who her family had been friends with the first wife's family back in the 20s, which was hard to get at because that's, you're going back there in time. And she wrote wonderful letters to me about what people knew about that wife, about their life, about what had happened during certain situations. So so that was a personal contact. Someone else who, Robert Barrage, a man in Indiana, has spent 30 years, he's a school teacher, and he spent 30 years every summer going around the country researching Rockwell. It's just his passion. So before many of the people were dead who did know Rockwell, he had gotten interviews, and he shared a lot of that information with me, which was, I deeply appreciated.
What's he done? What towns he live in Indiana?
I want to say Evanston. Is that
Evansville?
Evansville, right? Evansville.
What's he done with all of his material?
I don't know, and if you're listening, Robert, everybody wishes he would tell us what he plans to do, because we're not sure. Nobody knows for sure.
How old a man is he?
Only in his late 40s, I think. So he has. I mean, he started this when he was like 19 or 20.
And what kind of material does he have?
Well, the material that most of us are envious of is the interviews he conducted with people associated with that first marriage, because they're dead now. I think the brother of the first wife he interviewed.
Irene.
Yes, Irene. He interviewed Hottie, who was a real character and who had lots to say. And so I wish I could have gotten to him, but the man had died by the time I was around. So those kinds of things that I envy.
Couple of more paintings. This one, the card game, up top. It's actually called a bridge game. Where is that from?
Well, it actually is. I would have to remind myself, but I believe it's still in the collection at the museum.
It says Saturday Evening Post cover at one point.
Right, but the way that worked is the paintings themselves were usually returned to Rockwell, at least after a certain date. And so
that was 1948.
By that, he probably did get that one back. But in any event, the point of that painting was to experiment with perspective, and it was important because he had been so ambivalent about using the camera in his work, and he lagged behind other illustrators in doing that. But this particular painting shows you what he gained by doing that, by giving in finally, because he could take pictures and then paint from them from perspectives and angles he just couldn't get if he was painting live.
How big are paintings? Well, actually, you say there how big they were, 38 inches by 24 inches. And are all these in your book on display there at the Stockbridge Archive?
No, not all of them, because occasionally, for instance, there was a gorgeous series of paintings he did in the 1920s that were really done as ads for Edison Mazda. But at this time, people like Maxfield Parrish were he and Rockwell were doing these ads to show light as a new, the importance of light, of electric light. And they're beautiful paintings that stand on their own as art, but the General Electric owns that whole series, for instance, of 20 paintings.
What book is this for you?
Well, it depends upon how you count, which life. And my life as an academic, if I count that, this would be my fourth book. If as writing for a public that's not just in the academies, it would be my second.
Where were you an academic, or are you still doing that?
No, I'm not still doing it. The U.S. Naval Academy. I finished my PhD in '86, I think it was, and taught there for 10 or 11 years as a professor of English, very enjoyably.
Why the academy?
Let's see. At the time, the dictates of my husband entered into it and to where he needed to be in Washington. And so the job offers I got, I had to kind of think what would go best. And I was very happy to get that particular job offer because the faculty there has a good reputation.
Where did you grow up?
Clearwater, Florida, near the beach.
How long did you stay there?
I grew up there till I would stay till I was 18 or 19. I'm a Florida girl.
And then went to college where?
Florida State for my undergraduate degree, and then ended up doing my PhD back here at University of Maryland.
What's your PhD in?
British Romanticism and literary theory, kind of 20th century philosophy for Lit Crit.
Now, is this book the second book for commercial consumption, or the third?
Yes, it's the second one. I did a biography of an Art Deco painter, Tamara de Lempicka, and A Life of Deco and Decadence before this one, and she's kind of the opposite extreme, you know, the glitz and glitter and glamour.
What was the hardest thing about this book?
Deciding what my attitude was towards Rockwell, both as a person and a painter. I vacillated. I started being dubious. I mean, I started out, I was somewhat dubious. Then I had this kind of epiphany where I so appreciated him. It was a love affair, love fest. And then I went to the other extreme again, and then I had to step back and say, wait a minute, you know, what's the proper attitude towards one's subject as a biographer, and how can I best serve him and the project?
What caused the fluctuation?
I think it's something, I want to say it's something in his personality, because he did it with his kids, he did it with anybody who got very close to him. He was a master at creating desire, and I would even use the word manipulating that relationship, so that he invites proximity and intimacy, and you get close, and then you realize that that's as far as it's going to be allowed. And so then there's this kind of coldness. And I think that it took me a while to understand that dynamic, even though his oldest son had been expressing that to me in different words. You know, at least 4 or 5 visits, for 4 or 5 visits worth. He kept talking about that. When I would say, tell me what it's like growing up, he tried to say that. And I'd go away disgusted saying, come on, you're sounding like a victim, and this was a good father. And then I'd go back the next time and say, so you were a real victim? And he'd say, no, no, no. I mean, I wouldn't say that. So I think it was a dynamic in Rockwell's personality that...
Why did you get this from, and who's the oldest son?
Jarvis.
Why did you get it from Jarvis and not the other two?
Well, that's an interesting question, too. All the 3 sons are so different in personalities. I mean, more even, I think, than most siblings were. And Jarvis is the oldest. Had a particularly, I think, vexed relationship with his parents. Probably played out a lot of what Rockwell played out with his parents and so forth. You know, it's all kind of fell upon the firstborn son.
When you talk about Jarvis, there is a photograph of him here, and where was that taken?
That was in one of Rockwell's studios when he was using one of his children, Jarvis in this case, as a model. He did this often, the kids modeled for him. And he posed, if you see, he would show the pose he wanted for the model to take. He was a great ham actor. It's always said he wanted to be an actor if that had been given him as a choice. So Jarvis was modeling for him.
And when do you think he began to see a problem with his father?
Early on. He says one of his strongest memories is when he was 7 years old, and he and his father were walking around a reservoir, and he thought at that point that his father was going to open up to him. Now, I find this a little hard to believe that at 7 this kind of thing would be taking place, but Jarvis swears that he's correct on this, and that as they were walking around the reservoir, and just as he felt his father start to open up, whatever that means, he pulled back. And Jarvis says he realized at that moment that it was never going to be different.
What about the other 2 sons? What kind of relationships did they have?
The youngest, Peter, I think was the closest to his mother, you know, the baby, and his mother was spending the lavishing attention on him. And so in one sense, probably the least complicated relationship with his father. I think they were friends and not particularly close. But the middle son, Tom, my guess would be, was the closest to Rockwell and was the most like him. He was a writer, and his father asked him to help him with the autobiography, and just being around him, I get the sense of the humor and the irony, which was very much part of Norman Rockwell's humor, sense of humor, and the kind of mind. I think that Tom might have been the closest of the 3.
Was it difficult or expensive to get the rights for a lot of the paintings that you have in your book?
Well, it was not difficult or expensive, because the vast majority of them are copyrighted by the family. In other words, the family was very generous about cooperating. And so it was not a problem. It would have been a problem, I think, to get... I didn't use covers from the Saturday Evening Post as covers. If you notice, the logos aren't there on I used the artwork, the paintings. That, I understand, is a different issue, that the Saturday Evening Post is not as forthcoming.
We're looking at some of the paintings on here. What's the black and white at the bottom?
That was a story illustration that I found fascinating, because I think it preceded by just a year or so the movie Wizard of Oz. And if you notice, if you know that movie at all, when the awakening scene where Dorothy is back at her aunts and uncles, the Tin Man and Scarecrow, I think that movie took those personalities directly from this painting. if you can actually match them, the Tin Man and the Scarecrow and so forth. But it was for a story. I think, what is it, the Peach? It depends upon what title it was given when it was used different titles. But
Yeah,
the
it's
Peach,
Peach.
yeah, Peach.
What about the one right above that, where the woman's sitting on the bench?
Yeah, again, another story illustration that was early in Rockwell's career, and I thought beautifully painted. The oils and the color, the tonal variation there, as well as the dramatic use of space, I thought was a particularly nice example of those values.
And then up top there is the checkers game.
Yeah, that's actually Jarvis's favorite painting, and I was happy to hear that because it's possibly mine too. That painting is the color. It's impossible to describe. It's the values and saturation, the yellowness of the yellow and the scarlet of the red, as well as the folds of the clown's costume. Again, an illustration for a magazine.
Have you had any reaction from the family on the book?
They've read the introduction only, and they all three were characteristic. They all three were positive. And Jarvis, though, was, wow, I'm really interested in this. I can't wait to read this book. And I actually opened the book then, the next chapter, with a story about him, basically. So I hope he retains his enthusiasm once he reads it. But I got the sense from the sons that they felt I'd been fair. I'm sure they don't agree with all my assessments, but
you do get fairly intimate.
yes, I do.
And do you think they'll have the same reaction when they read all the gory details? And what I mean by that, all the personal relationships between the wives and all that?
The reason I think they'll be comfortable with it is we worked out a lot of their discomfort in person. I'm not good as an interviewer. I don't like to go there either. There's a sense of it's very easy to project yourself into the other person's position, and you say, how would I want somebody treating me? But I said to them, look, if we don't include this information, I can't give a fully fleshed portrait of your father. It won't be genuine. And there's a way to do it, I think, with a certain amount of propriety, which I think I maintained. And I felt as if I saw Tom Rockwell gulp visibly at times and make himself talk. I think that I was careful not to quote or attribute where I was asked not to. And so I think they'll be comfortable with what I've said.
Where do these four paintings, covers, I guess, of the Saturday Evening Post fit in his fame as he called himself an illustrator? But,
yes.
And what's the difference between an illustrator and an artist?
Boy, the last one is the subject of so many books and heated debates, so I'll start with the first one. The Four Freedoms, which are being plastered, reproductions of these all over New York City right now. It's amazing, and popping up in office buildings and on computers. The Four Freedoms was a series of paintings that Rockwell did to illustrate Roosevelt's, combination, the speech he gave to Congress in January of '41, and then the meeting he had with Churchill off of Newfoundland, and which resulted in the Atlantic Charter. The ideas that were promulgated in those two circumstances became known as the Four Freedoms, the abstractions in the long run that actually became, I guess, the backing to the UN's charters, too.
Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear.
Yes, yes.
And what time period?
Well, he painted those in 1942, and they were published beginning in February of 1943. Again, to promote the war effort, and actually the Treasury Department made $133 million off of touring those four paintings in 16 cities and selling them, selling war bonds. With the picture of one of them was on the cover, actually, one of the war bonds. So, but it was interesting because Rockwell was dying to do those. He wanted to do those more than anything, and I found a memo. He went to a doctor once, and apparently during this period he was told to have an operation, and the memo back to himself says, I can't, and then he underlines the line, this is more important to me than anything I've ever done. And it's more than the war effort. He was so idealistic. He was so pro living for living that kind of idealistic existence, that this was a chance, he thought, to put the big ideas into concrete form.
Where did he live in his life?
Well, he grew up until he was really in high school, or in the last year of junior high in New York City, and in what now is Harlem, Morningside Heights, and but it was a nice lower middle class neighborhood that he then stigmatized later in life as a dump and the source of all violence, which is interesting.
Now the picture, he is fairly easy to pick out in this.
Yes, he is.
The young fellow there on the left. Who are the others?
The boy next to him, standing behind him, is his very unattractive brother, not physically but emotionally, Jerry, as he was known, and then his father and mother, Waring, is seated holding the boy's mother, Nancy.
His relationship to his mother, Nancy?
Unpleasant in that Victorian. She was a product of a Victorian age, and that was replicated in their relationship. There she is. She was a coquette who got what she wanted. That she passed on to Rockwell, who, in spite of being Mr. Nice Guy, when he wanted something, definitely got it. I was told that again and again. But she was spoiled, and she also suffered from depression in a period where people weren't very good at analyzing that. I'm sure that influenced the relationship negatively too.
But how long in his life did she live, and what influence did she have on his family life?
On his early family life?
No, his late family life.
Late family life. He actually took care of her when her husband died in 1933. And he took care of her for another over 20 years financially. She would alternate living with Rockwell and his family, or at least down the street. He would put her in some nice apartment complex, or living with cousins in Rhode Island. There they are again.
1911. Where were they then?
1911, they would have been in Mamaroneck, New York. They moved to the suburbs of New York City, where Rockwell was much happier, Mamaroneck, and then a little bit later in New Rochelle, onto New Rochelle.
And in his adult life, where did he live?
Well, basically there were three major periods. He lived in New Rochelle until 1939. Then he moved to Vermont, a kind of bucolic community in Vermont, not very far from the New York border, though, once again. And then he moved
was this Arlington?
Yes.
And the picture you have in there of the Arlington house, this is, which house is this?
It's a gorgeous house that had a twin next to it, just like it, a kind of big old farmhouse that you went through a very romantic little covered bridge to get to. They enjoyed it very much because you could go tramping around the mountains behind, or visit the stream in front and go swimming.
How long did he live there?
Gee, I guess 10 years, at least, in that house.
See, when we started, you mentioned that he had 3 wives, and the first wife was Irene, married to her for 14 years. Which one is she in this picture? I can't quite understand.
Right, she's the one to the far right.
With the hat on in the
yes,
back,
yes.
Looking out?
Yes.
And all 3 boys were born from Irene?
No, the second marriage from Mary.
From Mary?
From
so
Mary.
They didn't have any children?
They had no children. Apparently, I found out, again, very late in the process, but I found out from someone who knew them that she refused to have children, and he very much wanted to.
What happened to the marriage?
Well, that's the marriage that she ran off with, embarrassed him very much, ran off with the brother of good friends of theirs in New Rochelle, very socialites, that he kind of had set him up. The socialites took him to Europe, and while they were gone, one of the couple, the woman of the pair, her brother, took Irene away, and for them to, I guess, consummate their affair. And when Rockwell got back, Irene notified him she wanted a divorce. It was very public because he was so well known and humiliating for him.
What happened to him then? What did he do?
He was very discouraged and depressed, and he left New Rochelle for a couple months and moved back to New York City, the city he supposedly hated so much he kept returning to, and holed up in a hotel and gave parties and tried to kind of find himself. Then went out to California after about 3 months and met and married within weeks his second wife, Mary Barstow.
Up there in the top left, and there she is where they're seated, and then finally down at the bottom with their son Jarvis.
Right. Aren't those happy pictures? It's hard to find pictures like that of Rockwell, where he's relatively spontaneous or being forced to be loose physically.
How long were they married?
Well, 30 years.
What happened to that marriage?
She, the last 10 years of their marriage, actually more than that, maybe last 15 years, she suffered from really aggravated depression that she not only was hospitalized for it, but she had to have electric shock treatments and so forth. And at the end of that marriage, she was not feeling well one day and went up to take a nap, and was only about 50 years old, and he went up to find her when she didn't wake up, and she was dead. Apparently, the cause was a heart attack. She'd had so much stress on her heart from various reasons. Although around town it was assumed she'd committed suicide since she had been suicidal for 10 years.
And what year did she die?
1959, August.
What impact did that have on him?
Well, there's actually a picture in there that shows him just so gray and haggard. He was lost. I talked to people around town, a professional photographer there, Clem Kalisher, who said he used to see him looking like death, just death, walking around town. You
Just
can
the
see in the
picture you're
mirror,
talking
yes,
about?
you can see his face there.
So is he actually looking into the mirror then?
Yes. And
And-
somebody took the picture.
And there's a picture of her there on the wall, right up the top.
Yes.
Actually, it's on the other page here. Is the
Right.
same picture?
No, that's actually, there's a slight difference in years. Those are two separate portraits.
But over there on the wall up there is...
Right. He loved her very much. It was a strong marriage. You know,
What impact did her death have on her 3 children?
by that point, they were all out on their own and had just gotten married, or at least, and so they grieved, but I think there's a sense, and I'm just surmising this from different things they told me, that they were somewhat relieved because she had suffered so much for so long with no cure in sight.
What's this picture?
That's a sad picture in spite of its occasion, which is Tom Rockwell's marriage. Tom is the young man to the far right, and his wife, Gail, and their parents are in the foreground looking excited and happy, and then Mary, who was receiving electric shock treatments and had just been kind of let out for the day. She and Norman are in the very back of the picture, looking out of place a bit, which apparently from stories I've heard, she did feel very much out of place at
We're
the
talking
wedding.
about them living in Arlington, Vermont, and then what year did they get to Stockbridge?
They got to Stockbridge. They spent a few years in around 1952, 53, going back and forth a lot from Stockbridge to Arlington, which is just a couple hours travel, for her treatments. And then they actually, in 1954, moved to Stockbridge permanently, and which means that actually they had been, it was more like 14 years they had lived in Arlington. And so now they moved to Stockbridge, and that was kind of the third major phase, in my mind, of his geographical locations.
When did he marry the second Mary?
Right, the second Mary, exactly, whom we'll call Molly. That was in 61, and let's see, that's the summer of 59 is when the second Mary, Mary Rockwell, the second wife, died, and then he married Molly 2 years later.
How was that marriage?
Very good. It was a calm, even-tempered, even-keeled marriage, kind of the opposite of what he had just had for 30 years, I guess. Of course, there were no children, and it was more a question, I think, of real deep companionship. She'd had a very rich life herself as a single woman, school teacher in a private academy, a very bright woman. And so she saw this as an adventure, being married to a famous illustrator.
In that photograph I just showed of the bicycles, you tell a story about the late years where they used to go out and ride their bicycles every day. What they went, you actually had the number of miles, 4.7 miles a
They
day.
were that precise. That was Molly's doing. She measured things like that and kept up with it. Yes, they did that every day, and it kept them healthy and hearty until the end, when there were a couple occasions where Rockwell fell off his bike and unexplained, and he couldn't remember afterwards what had happened. One time when they were in the Caribbeans, and it appears in retrospect he had mini strokes. I mean, little M-I-N-I, mini strokes, and they tried to deny it for a long time, to the point where they also had a routine of going out driving every afternoon, even though Molly was a terrible driver, and the townspeople kind of knew when they'd be driving and avoided them and watched out for them and yet avoided them. And finally all this had to be given up as Rockwell kept deteriorating.
And where's this picture from there?
Yeah, the last one, I had to fight to include that because those who love him, not his family but friends, didn't want to show him like that. That's at the very end of his life on his, what they call escapado, which is a little private area, their house that Molly had built that they could go out on and escape the crowds that would go by the street and try to gawk. And he had put a tea cozy, I don't know if you can see in that picture, but on his head he put a tea cozy. Even though he was at the very end of his life and often suffering from dementia, he still had this incredible sense of humor, and he was kidding with Molly, who's in the front, and the nurse in the back, and took the tea cozy and put it on his head as a hat.
Why is he important enough to have a biography written about him?
Because to many people, and by the way, in the world at large, Europe and the Middle East and the Far East, as well as America, he represents the idea of America in the 20th century. Now what people mean by that may be very different from what he intended or how he's best used, but he represents a kind of, there it is, exactly, saying grace. And that's a wonderful illustration of the idea of America as a tolerant, generous, capacious country where you, on the one hand, the right values obtain, prayer, sobriety. On the other hand, room for people who may not share those values and who nonetheless can be invited in. If you notice at the corner of that picture, there are actually slivers of people. There's somebody looking in that's deliberately not fully captured, as if to invite the audience into that painting.
1951. On the other page is this, the art critic, and his son didn't like this.
No, his son, in fact, none of his sons like it because it's so fraught with meaning. The woman in the portrait on the wall, the model for that was Mary Rockwell when she was ill with the depression.
Their mother.
Their mother. And the boy, the art critic himself, is Jarvis. He was used as the model. And then the group portrait on the other side, the Dutch fathers, represented a tremendous kind of matrix of influences in Rockwell's life, both his ancestral painterly antecedents, Rembrandt, Hals, but also his own father, who was very interested in Dutch art.
Why didn't they like this?
Because I don't know if it shows up on that reproduction, but the art critic is shown as examining with a magnifying glass the bosom of the woman. I mean, supposedly it's a pin on the woman's gown, but the joke is that he's leaning in too close, that it's lacking in decorum, and the Dutch fathers are laughing and mock dismay. So it was somewhat taboos were being violated there about mother-son relationships.
Have they ever totaled up the total number of paintings he drew in his life?
No, but a rough figure is that he did over 4,000 pieces, which would include ads and portraits and Saturday Evening Post covers.
How much was he worth when he died?
Not that much, considering. He had given away so many of his paintings because they hadn't become real marketable in terms of money until late. That a lot of his best works had been given away. Molly then tried to get them back for the museum, not for their own personal wealth. So I would say he was just an upper middle class guy in terms of his what he left then in terms of an estate or legacy.
You start off by saying that Charles Dickens played a role in his life.
Yes.
How?
I think it cannot be overstated, and this may be my background as a literature person in terms of my own training, but he said again and again how he was indebted to Charles Dickens, and people, as they often did with Rockwell's self-pronouncements, ignored that. But if you go back, his father read Dickens to him aloud every night for a couple of years when he was 7 and 8 and learning to draw. And he would actually draw from the Dickens stories. But even more important is that his view of life, and he says this very quietly but seriously a couple times in his autobiography, I was taught how to view the world through Dickens, including an insatiable curiosity. And I don't doubt that, absolutely. And also Dickens helped him give form to chaos. You know, anti-city, pro-pastoral, ways to act out or to give shape and form and impose narrative form on some of his own bogeys, I guess, psychological bogeys.
The last painting you have in the book is called The Connoisseur.
Right.
Where's that from? 1962.
Yes, but that painting's gotten a lot of press lately in terms of very good explications of it. But it is a wonderful example of what you just touched upon earlier, what Rockwell could represent to this country, this tolerance. He has a conservative-looking man standing there with his, even then, dated hat and cane and so forth, umbrella, looking at a faux Jackson Pollock. There's something that America would have seen as, oh, it's that abstract expressionist stuff. And it's a way of, he treats that abstract expressionist piece very respectfully. I mean, it's done fairly nicely. And he treats the conservative man respectfully. And he doesn't show us the face. So there's this amazing interplay of, in a museum, of one type of sensibility versus another.
Where do you live now?
In Brooklyn.
How many children do you have?
4.
4?
4.
At what age?
Oh, various ages. And I have to admit, 2 I inherited from my marriage, 2 from my own loins. A 16-year-old, 18-year-old, 24-year-old, 27-year-old. And
what's your husband do?
He was in the music industry, and he is now with an Israeli high-tech company it's American stations in New York City.
And do you have another book in mind?
I do.
What is it?
I can't tell you.
Why not?
Because I want to make 100% sure that it's the one I should do.
Is it a biography?
It is a biography, but I'm trying to think of an exciting new way to take the idea of a biography, not what Edmund Morris did with Dutch, and expand it into being about something else as well. How's that for oblique?
Our guest has been Laura Claridge, and this is what her book looks like. Norman Rockwell, A Life. Thank you very much.
Thank you.